It's my honor to welcome you here and our distinguished panelists. I have two of my colleagues here, actually. Our dear President, John Sullivan, who has been the speechwriter and special advisor to Margaret Thatcher. He has been the editor of several distinguished journals, like the National Interest. He is still currently the editor of the Quadrant magazine in Australia, and also editor-at-large at the National Interest, and even more importantly, editor-at-large at Hungarian Conservative and Hungarian Review, which are our own journals. Thank you, John, for being here with us. And I forgot the most important title, but he's the president of the Newby Institute. And then we have our director of research, David Martin Jones, who is also currently a visiting professor at King's College London and also at the Buckingham University in the UK. But he has spent more than a decade in Australia as well, working at several universities. Thank you for being here with us. And last but certainly not least, we have Tamás Baranyi here, who is now the Deputy Director, I believe, for strategy at the Institute for Foreign Affairs, Hungarian Institute for Foreign Affairs, which just has a name change quite recently. And he's, I think, one of the foremost American experts here in Hungary, so we're very lucky to have him here. So I will start with jumping to the obvious. The panel today, when I always hear talking about is it the end of American power, I remember this story, which is most likely actually not true, but myth has it that a New York journalist once contacted the London office and asked about the health of Mark Twain, because he thought that Mark Twain is either seriously ill or is already dead. And he sent back a telegram saying that the news about my death are greatly exaggerated. So when I hear talking about is American power over, I always think about this myth, because I'm not sure it's really as bad as a lot of people think. Of course, there's some problems, I think mostly internal problems, which relate to social problems and also kind of an unwillingness to maintain American hegemony. But you have those problems in some of the other powers which are trying to achieve hegemony, like China. So my first question would be to all of the panelists, actually, is how do you see this question? Do you kind of agree with me that some of these news are a bit exaggerated, so American decline is not as bad as it seems? Or would you say, yes, it's definite, the American hegemony, the world order is over, and we are now going to a multipolar world order? And I would ask first John to comment on this.
Thank you. Well, first of all, it's a great pleasure to be here, and I look forward to the discussion, and thank you, István. I think we do have a somewhat exaggerated impression of America's decline, because we're comparing its decline with the recent very unusual situation since 1989, when we lived for a while in what was called by the writer Charles Krauthammer a unipolar world. That is to say, between 1947 or 8 and 1989, there was a clear duopoly in world order, a contest between the United States leading NATO and the Western Alliance, and the Soviet Union leading an alliance of communist and states and sympathizers, including, of course, the communist Hungary of those days. That was a relatively well-ordered world in an odd way. Yes, there were wars, there were crises, but both superpowers had a very clear interest, which they recognized, in cooperating to the extent of avoiding conflicts between them becoming worse. There were dangerous moments, the 1962 Cuba crisis, but in the main, the two leaders of the two alliances managed the conflicts reasonably, I think, in retrospect, quite intelligently. At the end of that period, all of a sudden, one of them disappears. It implodes. I mean, one moment it seems to be one of the two superpowers. The next, it's plainly struggling to stay alive as an order, first of all, it has no choice, in my view, but still it surprised us that when it happened, that it had to let Eastern Europe become an independent group of states. It accepted that. And then Gorbachev had said at the Paris Peace Conference that this kind of thing would stop at the borders of the Soviet Union. We'll cease appeasing at that point. But they didn't. There was a revolution in the Soviet Union itself, and several states, notably the Baltic states, became independent. And all of a sudden, there's only one superpower. It's the United States. And that is the period we now compare with the present period in which America seems to be losing ground. Why is it losing ground? Because it overextended itself in various ways, as Paul Kennedy, the Yale professor, argued in the late 80s. The American empire might do. Well, at the time, we all said afterwards, well, look, he got it right, except he identified the wrong superpower that was overstretched. But then America did overstretch itself, it seems to me, in the period that followed. First of all, it embarked on wars which it wasn't prepared to pay either the financial or diplomatic price. Those wars ended not well. Now, they didn't end as badly as we now sometimes think. Iraq is a reasonably effective country. It's in a better state after a lot of bloodshed and crises and internal instability, a better state than under Saddam Hussein. But still, nobody looks back at the Iraq War and says that was a success. We say instead we identified the wrong important enemy in Saddam Hussein rather than Iran. And of course, financially, it has overstretched itself to the degree that it has an enormous debt obligation. And internally, it has allowed, allowed its economy to slip behind, and its educational system has been perverted, so that at the present time in the United States, what you have is an education system in which the concepts of the woke revolution are beginning to impact not only not only cultural studies, not only English literature, but also there's more and more the revolution of wokeness, which I won't bother to define here because there may be a debate about that as we go on. But the revolution of wokeness is now intruding into the hard sciences, not just biology. People are arguing that we have to have different ways of knowing in all of the sciences, and this is true throughout the Anglosphere, so that even in Australia, what you have is people saying that Aboriginal ways of knowing about the origin of the world deserve as much respect as those of physicists and science in general. So I think we are seeing a country that has serious problems which it has to solve. It's not at the peak of its power, but it has great resources, which I think we'll come on to as we go on.
Thank you, John. I think it's interesting because even people like Fukuyama are saying this now, that America overextended, even though those are the same people who were advocating for this liberal hegemony and that America should...
As I was.
Okay. Well, David, please share your thoughts as well on this.
Yeah. So I take it somewhat differently, or in a slightly different direction, in that the question is it the end of the American world order? But when or what was the American world order? Because it didn't begin just with the end of history moment, it goes back. And you could argue it begins in 1917, when America entered the world as a global, or as a great power, and was responsible under Woodrow Wilson for redrawing the map of Europe and beginning US relations with the Asia Pacific. And that was followed by a retreat from the world during the period sometimes called isolationism. The second attempt at a US-inspired order dates from 1945, where the US contained the Soviet Union, resisted the spread of communism, and established a free world order based on Bretton Woods, the IMF, NATO, and the hub and spokes alliances across the Asia Pacific. The US was then a superpower that both contested a seemingly monolithic communism, but also significantly presided over the demise of overseas European empires like the French, the British, and the Dutch. The third and perhaps strongest iteration of a US world order begins with the implosion of the Soviet Union after 1990, and the idea of, as we've just heard, the end of history, where the world moved to a borderless one of secular democracies open to trade and investment. The superpower mutated into a hyperpower in a unipolar world troubled at its fringes by the odd rogue state and non-state actors. This was the era of freedom's empire. In After Victory, John Eikenberry, a big enthusiast of the liberal order, assumed this empire, first intimated by Wilson, but culminating in Clinton, Bush, and Obama, was premised on international law, international institutions, promoting trade, human rights, and social justice. And ultimately, it wasn't about American power, but American power brokering a liberal institutional order. This understanding of America the good as a moral force in the world promoting trade and liberty is a key American myth and foreign policy tradition. The understanding reflected America, as one commentator said, great historian called Walter McDougall, a crusader state. For another great authority on American foreign relations, Walter Russell Mead, it was one of four traditions, the others being the Jeffersonian, Hamiltonian, and Jacksonian. The first two of these sought to distance America from the shortcomings of the rest of the globe and retain the US, as Walter McDougall termed, as opposed to a crusader state, a promised land. Certainly with Trump, there was a turning away from the Wilsonian tradition that characterized previous presidencies and had led to the debacle of Iraq and Afghanistan. More recently, Biden, in his Warsaw speech in February, resurrected the notion of America still crusading for liberty in the face of rising autocracies, but it now seems hackneyed and cliched. The current stance of the US and its Western democracies assumes not only an international legal order guaranteeing the rights of nations for self-determination, but also asserts the necessity of defending democracy wherever it is threatened against the growing global power of revisionist autocracies. From the perspective of Boris Johnson and Biden and their political advisors, the West is engaged in a Manichaean struggle between the forces of liberal democratic enlightenment and the dark power of aggressive and illiberal tyrants. Is the world, in this world then, that view of Biden seems increasingly fragile and hollow, given that America is still a great power. It is still the leading hard power in the world. But what was so attractive about it before the wars the forever wars in Afghanistan and Iraq was America's soft power, its power of attraction. People were attracted to America not because of its necessarily great economic performance or its brilliant military. It was because of its power to attract those who are attracted by its understanding of liberty and individualism and freedom. That has been hollowed out when Biden talks about promoting democracy in Warsaw and yet the country is riven by disputes about woke understandings of empire, colonialism, and slavery. The whole thing seems like as Oliver Dowden called it, a curious American psychodrama of self-loathing. That's the problem that the end of the American world order faces. It dies in its own self-laceration and guilt trip. And can that be reformed? I don't know.
Interesting. So if I understand you correctly, you're blaming partly this over liberalization or progressiveness, because my understanding is that America was a great power and basically won the Cold War because it showed people a better alternative. But now it's kind of difficult, especially as a conservative myself, if I look at America and see some of the crazy woke stuff going on there, to kind of root for America and accept American foreign policy. And also I think it's dangerous how this is intervened in their foreign policy. So we saw, I thought at first that it was a joke that the American embassy in Kabul was celebrating Gay Pride Month, but it wasn't. It was true. Actually, they did tweets of stuff about that in a country which is, let's say, if it's not overtly hostile, it is very hostile to homosexual people, and it's kind of. And now it's interviewed with USAID policy. So if I'm, let's say, a politician in Uganda, and I need aid, and America is saying, I'm only giving you aid if you accept, policies about homosexual marriage, transgender stuff, and then you have China, which says, here's my money and do whatever you want with it. I might choose China as well, which is, of course, not ideal, and of course there's other, back deals with China as well, which we might not know in this sense. But sadly, it makes sense for a lot of African and other countries to do that. And now I'm turning to Tamás, if he agrees on this. Do you think that kind of this overtly progressive foreign policy of America is getting a lot of people disillusioned with American hegemony? And also, is that kind of a contributing factor to why they're losing ground now, I think, in Africa and the Middle East and several parts in the world?
Okay, thank you for the question. Thank you for the invitation. The short answer for your question is yes, but I think it's a little more complicated because I think the erosion of America's public image as also a value inventor and a value spreader is under attack from two directions. One of them is what you just said about woke progressivism, which is completely undecipherable in most corners of the world outside the United States. But it is also under attack, I would say, from the curious manifestations of polarization. Ranging from the Capitol Hill story, or how the United States went from a decent voting from a country with a decent voting system to a vintage third world election that lasts 2 weeks to have the winner announced. So all those things contributed to the American convincing power being on the wane today. But getting a little bigger picture, so I want to answer the question whether the American power is in decline. I would answer with a tautology, then we should define really what power is and what decline is. Because just yesterday, very good professors of mine just really got really angry when I said the United States is clearly in a decline, and they started to explain me all the things that are contrary to this statement, yeah, but it's still the foremost military. Okay, I see that. The United States is, of course, in decline relative to itself in the 1990s, and especially the United States in 1945. If that be the case, that's a decline. That's nothing more but decline. So when I say the United States is clearly in decline, I don't say that it's going to fall, and definitely not that it's going to fall soon. Neither of which is true. The United States is in decline, which actually leaves some room for some leveling in international relations, especially coupled with the rise of other powers. But it's still not, multipolarity, but multipolarization, I would say. Even if there would be, completely formed other poles in the international system, the United States would be still far primus inter pares for, I think, a century. But telling anything about the future is difficult. But again, it's more like a primus inter pares in this sense also. However, what I feel a little dangerous here for the security of the international order, for the security of our country, for my security and yours, is the fact that the United States and its present government today doesn't seem to recognize those processes today. So I think the main tenet of American grand strategy today is to keep American unipolarity at all costs, and I am not sure. I'm pretty sure about the opposite. That if you accept the fact that the world will be multipolarizing, and you can already make arrangements to make it safer for you and for your interest, I think it's a better outcome than to stick with the previously tested and very comfortable unipolarity. So that's my general take on the question.
Thank you. I would like to turn back to John, because, as you mentioned, you were one of the people who were hoping for a more liberal world order back in the 90s. And so staying with the question, do you think that would you agree with this sentiment that America was much more powerful and much more of a beacon for third world countries in the 90s because it was still adhering to more classical liberal values, while now, because it's more adhering to progressive values, it's less of a beacon and perhaps less of a role model for a lot of third world countries?
Well, I think that, first of all, just to pick up what Tamás says, I think your point of view was confirmed by no less a person than Sam Huntington in about 2010 when he said, we're not living anymore in a unipolar world, we're living in a unipolar-multipolar world. And I think that is the case and probably will be for some time to come. Now, the change in America's view of itself, which may not be permanent, and I don't think will be, nonetheless has had and will have an impact on how other people think of America. And I would say until about 1960, you met Americans who were hostile to America very rarely. They existed, they were famous, but they weren't numerous. Virtually every normal American you met was a patriot, quite and proud, and that would be true particularly of immigrants. People would say things like, the proudest day of my life was when I became an American citizen. And I think it's true to say that the drawing power of America, and before Britain, the idea that people from these countries were culturally admirable and people wanted to be like that, is true. With the development of the anti-American American and the flourishing of that person, you get a very complicated set of calculations for anybody else. One famous story is Fuad Ajami, the distinguished Middle Eastern scholar, was talking to another Arab intellectual, and he said the man was launched into a savage denunciation of America in every aspect. And Fuad Ajami listened patiently, and then he said at the end of it, have you got your green card yet? And the man replied, bastard.
Good argument.
And what people think they think and what they think are quite different. An anti-American friend of mine, whose father was a CIA guy, almost inevitably, in Saigon, was on an anti-American and anti-South Vietnamese march in Saigon when the police came out and hit the marchers with nightsticks. And he was terribly indignant. And then he thought to himself, hang on, I've been saying for years that this is a corrupt tyranny, ruthless in dealing with its own people. How come I feel so outraged? And he said, because I suddenly realized I didn't believe any of those things. And it's perfectly true that if, for example, a regime is collapsing, or there's a war, the people who run somewhere else, they are always running to the American side. They're very rarely running to the communist side. I mean, and then there are people who have a real interest in gaining from that. So the impression of anti-American Americans and their imitators is whether or not the rest of us will have a low opinion of America, in my view, depends in part on the opinion of America that Americans have. They have, as both the other speakers have said, America is still a very important and powerful country. Why would people not, in a sense, respect it? And the answer to that question is because first, the Americans don't respect it themselves, and secondly, that there are no benefits to respecting it. There are a lot of benefits to being anti-American in America, and people know that, and they act on both those decisions, except that when push comes to shove and your life is on the line, they know in which direction to run.
Thank you, John. I think that's crucial what you said, because when you talk about American decline, and it might be American decline, if you look at even hard power, how many, let's say, soldiers they had, how many tanks they had, it's less than what they had in the 90s. But it's still the biggest power in the world. But what makes me, and staying with the woke things, what makes me a bit more, how should I say, disconcerned, is that, our dear friend Rod Jeher regularly sends me videos, CIA recruitment videos, where you have a nice Latina first-generation immigrant woman talking about how she faced depression and she's an intersexual and she found a lovely family in the CIA, or other recruitment videos of the military where you have a lesbian saying how she again found a very good family in the military. And as this kind of makes me think, because I personally don't think that a mentally disturbed person should be working for the CIA. I think that's a huge risk, and even 10 years ago I think that was a huge no-no. But also, if you see all these polls which are showing, especially in Europe, not necessarily in America, that a lot of the youth will not die for their country. So let's say you ask German youth if Germany would be attacked by Russia, would they go to war or would they flee? A majority will actually say they would just flee. And my question, and I'm turning to David because he actually wrote a book about Maoism and the West. But do you think this is a serious problem? So let's say if there would be a real war between NATO and Russia, or NATO and China, would our militaries really be good? And would our youth actually go to war?
Well, that's a good question. That's not about America. This is about Europe now, which is...
I think Europe is worse, but yeah.
Well, I think that is a good question, because I do get the sense whenever I go to the States that there's still, at least in certain communities, a strong sense of fighting for America. You know, what Mead called the Jacksonian tradition. And, after 9/11, I mean, people were flocking to sign up, because they wanted to take the war over there. That's a very strong part of an American myth of itself, really. Europe's gone very flabby, I think, and part of this is too deeply historical. I mean, the effect of what Christopher Coker, the LSE historian of war, calls the death events of the 20th century, the First and Second World War, gave a very strong pacifist flavor to European thinking. And because Germany, which saw itself as responsible, was responsible for the Second World War, if not the first, because Germany after 1945 radically reformed its sense of itself in a way that has affected the whole conduct of the European Union, has meant that, as I wrote in not The Strategy of Maoism, but another book called History's Fools, the manner in which European thinking became about idealism, or what was in the international relations literature called normativism, that we follow just norms and global social justice, but we don't have an army, because what we'll do is manage problems rather than address them as from with the capacity to have a hard power. And in that process, the Europeans seem to have forgotten what was central to their thinking in the 19th century and in the 18th century, which was the idea of raison d'etat, the idea of, that you, in terms of conducting foreign relations, you had to have a clear idea of your interests and how to sustain and protect them, whether that's a European interest, a German interest, a Hungarian interest, that in order to protect those interests, you must be both economically powerful, but also have a military. You don't dissolve your militaries and think that, well, America's there, we can always rely on NATO. You can't, because as Palmerston said in the 19th century, there are no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, only permanent interests. And Frederick II, interestingly, said, to have a state without a military is like having an orchestra without instruments. And Europe went into the Ukrainian war as an orchestra without instruments. While it was practicing this idealism, this ethical idealism in foreign relations, revisionist powers were seeing the weakness of the West, not particularly the weakness of America, but the weakness of Europe. And Europe needs to do some, I think, very hard thinking about what its identity should be. We talk a lot about identity in the woke world, but European identity as a group of countries that stand for a tradition, not just a Western tradition, but a very strong European tradition, the manner in which wokeness and our educational systems are undermining that will defeat us. We won't be, as the great German philosopher Eric Voegelin said, a civilization is defeated long before it's defeated on the battlefield. It dies from within. That's what happened to the Roman Empire. That's what's happening to Europe, particularly at the moment, I think.
Okay, and you're not sure that that's happening to America as well?
I think America has got... I think America is suffering from a sort of a moment of self-lacerating psychodrama under the Democrats, but a Republican government could change that very dramatically. In Europe, there are sort of populist movements, but at the moment the Euro bureaucracy and the bureaucracy in the UK is all against anything like promoting a strong sense of national identity. That seems as the ultimate anathema. Ooh, I'm British. I should be proud. Well, can't possibly be proud of that. I can be proud of being Scottish or Irish, but English? Ooh, I don't think so. And I think that's true across the elite understanding of Europe generally. Americans still have, or in pockets of America, certainly on the Republican side of things, Americans still, say allegiance to the flag. You couldn't say allegiance to the Union Jack. You'd have a riot.
Sadly, that's true. But staying on this a bit, so you mentioned that a lot of the failures of Europe kind of defined how, let's say, the rest looks at Europe, and I do agree, because it seems that Europe can't even keep peace in its own neighborhood. But I think that's kind of true for America as well, because the debacle in Iraq, the debacle in Afghanistan kind of sent a message to the rest of the world that America is not really willing to keep up its commitment. And I think partly the Ukrainian war is about this as well. So my next question would be that how do you see the Ukrainian war in this kind of chess game? So if, let's say, Russia can win this war, will that be a huge game changer in the system? So would that send kind of an evident message that the unilateral or kind of a America-led world order is over and we are going to a multipolar shift? And perhaps I would ask Tamás first about this.
Okay, so the most complicated question. Thank you, Maraj. Obviously, Russia winning the war would be a very serious blow to like everything that the United States and his sophisticated alliance system stands for. But I don't think it's a very likely eventuality that Russia would, in the classical sense of the word, win the war. However, I also would neither believe that Ukraine, let's say, in any classical sense of the word, would win the war. That means that it will not be, a great discursive victory for the West either. I wouldn't go deeper into the issue of the war, but I think at the end, because wars have an end. This war is going to have an end as well, and most wars have a negotiated end, and I think this is where we are inching to, and the precise details and the precise details of this negotiation will be used by both sides to point out, no, the United States is, is giving up on her commitments, and yes, the West is still much more superior in terms of military, but also in terms of military doctrine, and both will be true. So I don't think there will be a decisive, discursive instrumentalization of the war. There will be pieces emanating from, again, the details and the proportions of these negotiations that will be used by both sides. I don't think, anyway, that the United States military power was seriously affected by this outcome, and also that this discursive blow would be decisive. I tend to agree with actually both gentlemen that this waning of U.S.'s convincing power is a key factor of this decline, and also the restructuring of American values, because American values have always been universal. That was that made it possible for instrumentalization. This is the American package. This is for all of you. And now the U.S., to my mind, is really, they're proselytizing very particular values, which are really not for everyone, not even for most Europeans, but the European elite, and definitely not for the world outside Europe. And if the United States, closely followed by the Anglophone world, secludes itself from the rest of the world, I don't think that's the right path if you want to maintain global dominance.
You want to chip in, John?
Well, I agree. On the point of the fact is the woke values, which are being made the basis of crusade, as David said, by the Biden government, are the views of about 15% of the American people. They divide America as much as they divide America from other people. But I do think they're very important. But just on the Ukraine war, Yes, I agree. How it ends will be extremely important. If it were a Russian victory, it would be an extremely serious matter because an alliance between Russia and China would appear to have been the victor over the West. And that would have a bad effect. But I do think when you look at the impact that the war has already had in Europe, which is to say it's creating new alliances, there is one in effect between the Brits, the Poles, the Ukrainians, the Swedes, and the Balts, because they're the ones who are most hawkish, and the ones who are least hawkish, obviously Hungary, but I think also Germany and France. They're the ones who are most nervous about this. What do I think is the long run? And this is directly addressed to the title of this topic. We all talk about divisions in Europe, and they're real and important and interesting. But the divisions between Europe and the rest of the world, including Britain, are also interesting because I can see that as America becomes more and more conscious of its need to defend itself against China, it is building a series of alliances in Asia, and also alliances with the rest of the English-speaking world. Whether or not that's wise from the UK's point of view is another matter, but the cultural appeal of joining an alliance with America, Australia, not at the moment New Zealand and Canada, will, I think, be very important in British politics, and there's going to be a division increasingly in the West between the English-speaking world and the continental world. There will be people in both halves of that division who are more sympathetic to the other side, who would really, Europeans would really like to be part of the Anglosphere, and members of the Anglosphere would like to be part of Europe. But that will be an increasingly important division, I think, and between these countries, an increasingly important division in the West. We don't know how it's going to work out.
Thank you, John. That's actually very interesting. I didn't really think about that because my next question actually would have been about the fault lines which the war is seemingly showing now. And I didn't really think through that there might be, bigger fault lines in the, let's say, Western camp, because usually you see that most of the West kind of went full support of Ukraine. But I would say 2/3 of the world, or let's say the developing world, is neutral or sometimes even sympathetic to Russia, but of course that's the minority. And do you see that this war is, and this is going to be the last question because we really are running out of time, that the war is basically showing fault lines, and could this lead to the new power structure? So are we seeing that there's, let's say, America with part of the West as a new kind of power bloc, and then you have China as a potentially power bloc, but what is again with India, various Brazil, South Africa, and I will ask this first to David Martin Jones, if you can answer it quickly so the other two gentlemen have...
Sure. Well, I could go on, but no, I'll try and be quick. I think this comes back to what Samuel Huntington, presciently foresaw in the 1990s. Namely, we are moving into a world of civilizational clash. And one of the, and it's not uninteresting, although Huntington is not read at King's College London or the LSE, he's closely followed in Beijing and Moscow. So Huntington's idea that we are falling into civilizational blocks and that these blocks are kind of what Carl Schmitt, another thinker who's very prescient on world politics from the 1930s, argued we fall into Grossraum, greater areas of interact or alliance formations. So Orwell in 1984 saw three permanently contested blocks: Eurasia, Oceania, I can't remember what the other one was, but those blocks are now sort of seemingly the dominant players in a world civilizational clash. Europe, the Anglosphere, and the Sino-Eurasian bloc seem to be the most important ones, with India a kind of on the brink of joining a quad arrangement with Japan and Australia and America. But that seems to be the structure that's evolving.
Interesting. Would you agree with this, Tamás?
Absolutely. I would just add one thought on this. I think much depends on how the West defines itself, whether it defines in like a much narrower concept. The West is is the club of the very polite, very rich, very sensitive persons in the Western edges, or if it defines like Europe, getting back more to geographical self-definitions and also allowing to a much larger degree of diversity in the normal sense of the word, because one is, I think, is a self-inflicting wound, I would say, and the other one seems to be the right strategy. But standing still in a civilizational clash would require a wise choice.
Thank you, John. In like a 1 minute closing remark.
The 1 minute is this, that I share the admiration for Sam Huntington. In fact, I got to know him in the last 10 years of his life when we helped to publicize his last book. But in his famous book on the Making a World Order and the Clash of Civilizations, he says that the most interesting fact about the civilization we call the West is that it doesn't have a single central power around which everybody clusters. The other civilizations do. No one doubts that Sino-civilization is built around China and so on. So this is a source of weakness in the West, and of course it's the source of the division I've just mentioned before. And I do think that everybody should read Huntington, actually, not just the Chinese and the Russians these days, because it's based on realism, but a realism that, unlike some realism, takes into account the importance of cultural drives and cultural loyalties.
Thank you, gentlemen. Please join me in a round of applause for our distinguished speakers. John, David, Tamás, thank you for being here and sharing your thoughts with us.